This is Cameron Collins of Unincarcerated Productions, and you're listening to Justice Delayed.
You decide what you want to be when you grow up.
Isidoro Izzy Rodriguez is the award-winning deputy editor for The Crime Report, one of the nation's leading comprehensive news services covering the diverse challenges and issues of 21st century criminal justice. Izzy's focus in reporting is police reform, where he explores topics ranging from police training and policing the mentally ill, to whistleblowers and police sexual misconduct. Join Jodie and Billy as they sit down with Izzy to discuss the latest stories he's covering for The Crime Report. Here's the episode.
Our guest is Isidoro Rodriguez, an investigative reporter in New York City, who is also the deputy editor of The Crime Report. It is the only, quote, comprehensive news service covering the diverse challenges and issues of criminal justice in the 21st century in the U.S. and abroad, and is staffed by journalists in New York, Washington, and Los Angeles.
Izzy primarily covers police issues, such as policing the mentally ill or police misconduct. He also deals with whistleblowers who expose wrongdoing and face consequences for it. The Crime Report is dedicated to covering a wide range of other issues impacting criminal justice reform. Izzy attended the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He has received outstanding awards for his work in a career that actually began in 2016 after he graduated from that Ivy League college. Izzy is no stranger to podcasts either. He is co-host of Behind the Blue Curtain, a weekly podcast that covers policing issues and race relations around the world. Izzy is also easy to reach. Email him at izzy@thecrimерeport.org. First, I'm sure, Izzy, that our listeners would like to know, how did you launch a career in criminal justice?
Oh, well, for starters, thanks for that nice laundry list of things that I've done. I've never heard it laid out like that before. So I actually kind of just fell into journalism. It kind of happened by happenstance. I actually went to John Jay College to major in English, which was my major. Journalism turned out to be my minor. And I just happened to take a Journalism 101 course as an elective. And I enjoyed it, and then I was lucky enough for a professor there who is still the co-chair of the journalism department at John Jay, Alexa Capilotto. I was fortunate enough for her to see something in my writing and my potential, and she recommended me for the internship at the Crime Report, and I interned at the Crime Report, and it kind of just rolled on from there, and I just kept on writing and kept on working, and here I am, almost 6 years later.
How exactly do you think the Crime Report impacts the criminal justice in a broader sense? And how does it impact on specific issues, like you deal a lot with police issues and you deal a lot with the death penalty? How does the Crime Report impact these issues? Do you think they move the dial one way or the other?
I think that we kind of get one of the main things that we do really well is provide as close to these days as you can get to an objective lens on those topics and other topics. We've got a great resource in terms of academic professionals in the criminal justice community that you can find at John Jay and in other colleges around the country. We also stay close in touch with criminal justice professionals, police leaders, probation and parole leaders, and then we have a good connection with a lot of the studies and the research that's ongoing. So we're not just a news source, but we're also a major resource for anyone who's trying to understand or pursue their own interest and studies into the criminal justice field. I think in terms of turning the dial, we are an exclusively criminal justice news source, and that's a rare thing. A lot of news organizations focus on multiple things all the time, so you can't get that kind of fine-tuned perspective that we provide. So I think that having the sources that we have, having the resources that we have, having the professionals behind us that we do allows us to engage with our readership and with the community in a much more focused way than, say, you're a major media group, which will give you like a 2-minute segment on a topic or a 5-minute read on a topic. Whereas we have the opportunity and the ability to go much more in depth into any one topic or multiple topics.
Well, give us an example of the things that you all touch on daily to do exactly what you just described instead of just lambasting everybody with news out of the chute?
Well, it's a process. I'm up at like 7 a.m, and I just am scouring all the news organizations that I can find. I've got a long list of some of the major ones that I plug into to try and find the right stories. And then once I get down that list, I'm literally going onto Google and trying to find as many criminal justice stories that I have to. Then I filter through those, and then we go through a process. I send it into my editor-in-chief, Steve Handelman. He looks them over. My assistant editor looks them over, and we kind of as a group decide on what are going to be the major stories that will kind of touch on the most key topics of criminal justice that we can find that day. So that's the process we work through, and then we try and make sure that we summarize them as concisely as possible so that you can either come on, and if you just look at the newsletter, you can get the summary and get the main idea of what's going on, or you can follow the link through directly to the story and get more in-depth coverage. The summarization is probably one of the key things that we try and do, because if you make it too long, sadly these days, people are always in a hurry and nobody likes to read too much. So you have to try and find the right amount of information in the shortest amount of sentences and paragraphs to get it in.
When you're information gathering, you take, like, they've had 3 cases that's captured national and international attention over the last couple months. One was the Julius Jones death penalty case in Oklahoma, the Ahmaud Arbery trial in Georgia, and the Cal Rittenhouse trial in Wisconsin. The broader issues are out there. Everybody speaks about them. Everybody has anything to do with criminal justice, or the legal system kind of speaks to them in broad terms. Do y'all have a way, a mechanism to reach inside those cases to find out, for example, what the defense attorneys may be thinking or what the prosecution may be doing? Or is it something that you look at simply as a social and criminal justice issue and take it from there?
Well, it depends. So for things like the Ahmaud Arbery case and the Kyle Rittenhouse case, at least for when we're just on our daily newsletter and stuff like that, we don't usually put anything on that until a decision has been reached or something really poignant happens with the case that deserves talking about it. But that being said, we will often have top stories that are done by the members of of the crime report that will touch on things such as the gun laws that affected the Kyle Rittenhouse case, such as the stand your ground laws that affected the Ahmaud Arbery case, and the citizens arrest laws that affected that as well. We'll have topics that touch on those issues. And then we also have, which is one of the things which is really great about us, we have a database of research going back about 10 years that if we do a story or do a summarization on some specific thing that's happening in any of those cases, we will connect to it so that the reader can take a deeper dive into research and studies that will support or back up any topic that we choose to discuss on cases like that.
We are at this juncture in a highly polarized society. There's a lot of hate out there. Threats have become a way of life. Threats have become a way of getting your point across. And the crime report deals with a lot of controversial issues. For example, if you deal with a gun issue, I know there has to be some backlash. The attorney I work for, anytime we post a blog up dealing, for example, with a gun issue, there's going to be just a whole flood of backlash from gun rights people. Do y'all experience that at the crime report? The threats, the emails, the vile language, the whole 9 yards.
Well, I will say that we are fortunate in the fact that we lean more academic than what's the word I'm looking for, like catalytic in terms of our news coverage. We try to approaching it from a strictly a basis of questions and research, and academia allows us to kind of approach the subject from as many perspectives as possible. Well, one thing we do when we do get people, because we get people who will email us and say they didn't like the article or they disagreed with it. One thing we will do is we will invite people to come on and write their perspective, write their viewpoint in response to any story that we've done. I mean, within reason. Yeah. But we try to establish a dialogue to kind of retain that objectivity. We had a story the other day that we covered that had to do with this new lie detector technology that's coming out now. I'm going to mess up where they're from, but there's a company that has invented this new technology that does it decides whether you're lying based on eye movements. And the Washington Post did a story on that, talking about kind of the details of the technology and leaning towards why it might not work as well as people say. And that was just a rundown that we did on a Washington Post story. But a representative of that company got in touch with us and said, hey, the Washington Post didn't give us a fair shot. And so we gave them the opportunity, and we said, hey, if you want to put in a viewpoint and talk about these points, you are welcome to send in an op-ed. And they did. And I think it's going to be out next week.
Good. So you tried to accommodate all the various interests and all the various points of view, irregardless. In other words, you're not a politicized criminal justice publication, the Crime Report. It is a factual, fact-based presentation of issues and reform efforts, and any other way that you want to describe it. It's not taking a political stand. And I think a lot of times when it comes to criminal justice, that can hurt the effort if you politicize the issue. And a lot of ways, that's what happened with the death penalty and with gun violence issues.
Oh yeah, 100%. And I like to think, and we try to do that. I mean, in this day and age, objectivity, quote unquote, is kind of illusory. It's very difficult to grasp onto because there's so many different perspectives. But at the Crime Report, yeah, we try to avoid those politics. And in my own work, I go way out of my way to try and make sure that I'm getting as many perspectives on any topic that I'm trying to approach. Because it's you're right. Things are becoming very politicized. Things are becoming very polarized. And the problem with that is there's oversimplifications that are happening on issues that are very complex. And if you don't try to acknowledge and at least observe that complexity, you're going to miss out on reform at the end of the day.
How does the political polarization, and when I say the political polarization that we've experienced over the last 4 years and what we've experienced in the last 10 months that Biden has been president, over the election fraud issue, the big lie, and you have both parties refusing to even accommodate the other's interests. How does that affect the academic approach to criminal justice? I mean, when you know academically that an issue is a certain way, but you have a web of lies and distortions and everything else that may circulate around the issue because of politics, how do you steer clear of that and stay focused strictly on the academic issue?
I mean, for me personally, it's not too difficult. I try and keep politics out of the writing, and as long as you pursue the facts and pursue the sources and the perspectives, as long as you're coming from a place of kind of diversity in terms of opinions and thoughts and perspectives, you usually can be all right. I think a lot of the problem now is that, like you just said, even journalism has become politicized, and you have journalists and people writing with an intent other than to inform. And I think at the Crime Report, and me for myself, we always have that intent to inform. And the thing that a lot of people have problems with is that if you're trying to inform, you have to give even perspectives that you don't agree with yourself. You have to try and ignore your own personal opinions or your own personal politics, and you have to seek out the people that may not agree with whatever perspective that you're talking about. So, I mean, I cover policing mostly, and that's a contentious topic. And so if you find yourself covering something like that, and you find yourself just having a list of people that are suddenly starting to all say the same thing or all sound like they agree with each other, you need to break right and find somebody who's going to contend with that and is going to present a different opinion, because it's very rarely cut and dry.
Well, you all represent something that died in 1987, and it was called the Fairness Doctrine, which was one of the last things that Ronald Reagan threw out of the federal government from the FCC as he left office. When I was trained as a journalist at Columbia University, I graduated in 1985 with my master's in journalism. We were always taught, and up to that point, the news had been, quote unquote, balanced. So if you had a critical issue, you were supposed to give equal time. And one of the things I did after I stopped daily reporting, it was part of my job, among other things, to track equal time and report that to the federal government every single month. And in 1987, it was goodbye to the Fairness Doctrine. So now there is no imperative to present both sides of an issue. And this is what we're
Exactly.
stuck with. And to me, that is the genesis of the problem. That is what it goes back to. So therefore, it's very easy to have, and I think of it in this way, and please don't laugh, it's like an Australian is president of the United States of America because he owns Fox News and they distort everything, which is perfectly clear, and they tell only their side of the story, and they make up a lot of things that are not factual. And the reason they get away with it is because there is no fairness doctrine. And so now we suddenly have social media, we have all these other different kinds of venues where you can say anything you choose, and you don't have to source it, you don't have to link it, you don't have to back it up at all. And that's the reason, to me, that the crime report is so incredibly valuable and that it needs to be funded and it needs to be ongoing, because you guys are doing what should be done to inform the public.
I mean, we're trying. I appreciate that. I will say the one thing about the social media thing is it's interesting because it's kind of a double-edged sword. Because at one point I agree with what you're saying, but at another point, social media in some cases has proven to kind of combat that problem that you're talking about, that bias that you find in like Fox News or even the Uber left media, where you've had people on the ground on social media who have been able to provide facts that major media organizations haven't been able to get to or have clouded over, and it's actually resulted in stories kind of changing course because of that. It's a very interesting evolution that's happening right now where social media, what's the word to look for? Social media personalities are starting to come out and try and report the news. It's interesting and it's scary at the same time because of what you just said as well, because there is no regulation on what they can and cannot do. But then at the same time, like you just said, if major media is going to continue to lean towards biases, what is our counter to that? How do we fight back against that, other than, through organizations like the Crime Report and people that are less politicized and have their loyalties kind of cut and dry? It's one of the things, because I just finished a semester in grad school actually for journalism, and it's one of the topics that's going around school right now is social media and the role it plays in the evolution of journalism.
Well, to me, as the Washington Post says, democracy dies in darkness. The crime report is focused on light and on information. And the point you made is very good. You can find things in social media that inform the public of what they didn't know and may stop a trend going in a direction that's the wrong direction simply because of politics or whatever. But I have been afraid ever since 1987 that we would somehow wind up in this fix. And I really personally believe, which is why I think the crime report is so important, because everybody's concerned about crime. And I think the reason that it's so important is that you all play the middle of the road. Here are the facts. Look at both sides of the issue. Here are the facts. And that, to me, is what makes the crime report so incredibly outstanding. Now, I look at the popularity of crime stories, true crime stories, for example. They're all over television. YouTube, for example, 2.5 million subscribers to Real Stories, and most of them are stories about crime. And then you've got novels, more than 1.6 million print copies of true crime books sold in 2018. You look back at 2016, that was only 976,000. So the people are there, the audience is there. The problem is getting the information to them. And that's what you all do. And that's what, to me, is so incredibly important. I really do firmly believe, and that's the reason the First Amendment is the first one in the Constitution, and it deals with the free press. It deals with journalism, because otherwise, like the Washington Post says, if you don't have information, forget it. You're going to end up without a democracy.
Oh, absolutely. I will. One thing I will say about the whole true crime fad is I get a little bit frustrated and I have to laugh, because anytime I tell somebody what I do, I say I'm a criminal justice journalist, and they're like, "Oh, you mean like true crime?" And I'm like, "No, like criminal justice reform." And what's funny is that true crime is good because it has that interest. But I find when you get into the issue of reform, when you get into the nitty gritty of the details of what goes into changing these things that are happening in this country, people lose interest or they get angry at the facts that you're presenting them. Oftentimes, especially with the policing thing, I remember when the protests were happening last year, everybody was really emotional and really angry, rightly so. But I remember trying to explain kind of the details of the problems with policing, and people would get frustrated and angry because it wasn't a black and white, simple presentation. So I wonder, like, the true crime audience is there, but I wonder if the true crime audience is really interested in the type of stuff that we at the Crime Report talk about, because they always seem to be more interested in those kind of intriguing, whodunit, true crime stories. But then you talk about something like police sexual misconduct, whistleblower rights, or anything like that, and in my experience, they kind of glaze over a little bit because it's drier.
That sort of leads into a question. It's a hard question in some respects. I'm not trying to put you on the spot with it. The crime report and the journalism that y'all produce is aimed at the academic community. I'm sure criminal justice professors get a lot of valuable information that they can pass on to their students in the classroom. The marketplace there is for academians. But how does that translate, Izzy? It's like a select community.
Mm-hmm.
How does that translate into reaching down into Jack Abbott's belly of the beast? How do you get down there? Or how do you get into the police stations? Or how do you get into the corrections headquarters? How does the factual presentations that y'all are making, the quality journalism that you're producing, how does that filter down to the bottom feeders of the system? How does that work?
So wait, you're asking, how does our journalism reach?
Is it just academians?
Oh, okay, yeah, I get what you're saying. So a lot of our audience are part of the kind of criminal justice academic community. A lot of them are because of the type of journalism that we do. And we're actually now in the process of trying to figure out just exactly how to do that, to widen our audience, to get in non-academics, to get in younger people, to get in a wider, more diverse audience, because like you said, it is necessary to kind of expand that information. And kind of doubling back to what we were just talking about, it kind of goes into our social media presence and what type of information we're getting out on that platform and stuff like that. Because like I said earlier, unfortunately, people aren't, they don't want to read as much as see or hear about it. And by accessing through social media, we're hoping to kind of provide that kind of visual presentation of the topics that we discuss to kind of get it into a streamlined way. But it's tough. It's very, very difficult to kind of walk that line and try and evolve in a way that we can kind of retain our integrity, retain that kind of clear-cut, factual based, but then also make it catchy and eye-popping and attention-drawing.
The crime report, I know that you accept submissions from the inmate community, mm-hmm. or police officers or whoever that work at the bottom of the ladder. Mm-hmm. Is there a concerted effort made to try to get that real life experience through opinion pieces and what have you? I know Jodie wrote a piece about her book for the crime report. So I know that you'll reach out to authors, or you'll give authors a forum. But more and more publications are offering outlets for inmates to speak to issues. Is that something the crime report does too?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we provide an outlet for people that are currently serving, people who have served time. We're always looking for resources and sources like that. In fact, and we oftentimes prefer that to I'll go to my editor and have an idea for a story instead of having me write it. He'll be like, why don't you see if you can find somebody who's actually experiencing that to get them to write on it instead. Right. So we always try to, because you have to. You can only tell a story so much and have it have enough of an impact, but then if you get somebody who's actually living the experience, it hits a lot harder, and also you get a lot more details that you'd otherwise wouldn't be able to uncover.
I found, I post up regularly on Facebook, and while I deal with a wide range of issues when I post on Facebook, I also try to deal with criminal justice issues. And what I found is that, for example, when I was explaining in a recent Facebook post about executive clemency and what Governor Kevin Stitt did to Julius Jones, how he give him a penalty, a punishment that is actually going to be far worse than death itself. And when you explain this to people, and I had a writer, and I've had a number of other people comment, I'm glad you explained this to us. So I think even in Facebook, you have people that's more and more trying to analyze issues. You can't do it in a large context because you keep your pieces at 500-600 word max, and you try to get as much information as you can that is easy to understand and easily to digest. So I agree with you that social media can play a part, and people can use their Facebook page. And I see a lot of Facebook traffic where inmates apparently are going through their outside families and they're posting up their stories and their opinions on Facebook.
Well,
absolutely. I mean, there's been so many incidences that happened. I mean, there were the prisons in Alabama where there were inmates who had gotten a hold of cell phones and stuff like that. And the only reason we found out that was happening inside those prisons is because they were posting on social media and sending videos.
Yeah.
That makes it very valuable. But when I look at the range of criminal justice stories every single day, it's like a soap opera. People are telling, and that makes it interesting when you get the real life story. We've interviewed Sister Helen. She wrote the preface to my latest book. And then we had a book that we wrote after Billy was paroled in 2006 about capital punishment. She wrote the preface for that. And so I asked her at one time, I said, Sister Helen, how do we approach criminal justice reform? And she has got that New Orleans accent, which makes her incredible to interview. And she said, tell their stories. Show the human being behind the facts. Tell their stories. And that's often one of the aims that Billy and I have with this podcast, in as much as we can, is to tell people's stories, to shine a light on the suffering, on the things that people don't really know about, think they don't have time for, because there's a lot going on. A lot of people are suffering for different reasons. But you got a whole range of stuff out there about, the United States has 5% of the world's population. It has 25% of the world's prisoners. And what is going on in a lot of those prisons is perfectly terrible. And we keep seeing these cases turn up, like the most recent ones, where the facts in the cases that were presented to juries, evidence was left out, evidence was distorted, all sorts of things like that, cover-ups by certain members of police forces and so forth. And I also worry a lot about racism. And the reason that I do is because so often members of minority communities are painted with a brush where people automatically assume, oh, well, they must be criminal, or they're not as good as white people. And then you look at the projections from the U.S. Census 2020, and it projects that by 2022, Texas will be a predominantly Hispanic state because the birth rate among Hispanics is soaring, while the white birth rate has been plummeting for the last 20 years. And that, in addition to lack of a fairness doctrine, that also concerns me, because I attribute a lot of what I am seeing on the political side in terms of violence. To me, the reason for that is because people understand in this country, by 2045, according to these U.S. Census projections, white people will be a minority in the United States of America, because there's no change in this plummeting birth rate. And I have to laugh to myself, because I think about, because as old as I am, I think back to Betty Friedan and the women's movement in the 1960s. And, we don't have to wear aprons and stay in the kitchen anymore. We can get out and be people and have jobs and so on and so forth, which rarely gets mentioned. But it is the racism issue. It is the statistics from the census that worry me. And also the lack of the Fairness Doctrine, which makes me so grateful for you guys.
Yeah, I mean, the racism permeates everything. I mean, in this day and age, I guess that's one of the negative positives, that people are being forced to confront it despite apparent resistance to the realities of it. But it is concerning, and it is concerning how we don't seem to really understand how much it has affected both the culture of this country in general, but then also the culture of criminal justice. I mean, I talk about it all the time in my stories about policing and stuff like that. It's in there. I mean, I remember when the right before the January 6th Capitol riot happened, the FBI released that report that said that white supremacists were attempting to infiltrate police departments. And that was a good report, but I remember looking at it and kind of laughing and being like, well, they're already there. They've been there since they started policing, because policing started as, I mean, partly as slave catchers, but we don't want to acknowledge the culture that is created, and how doing things like, you know, those band-aid over bullet hole solutions that they come with, they always talk about the training and recruiting and stuff like that. And it's like, if you're not talking about changing this culture and acknowledging that this exists and it's everywhere, we're not going to get to where we need to go, because things just focusing on training isn't going to solve this. You can do community policing out the yin yang, and you can say we brought in new training and we're doing de-escalation, and you can say all of that, and you can be doing all of that. But if you're not dealing with the inherent culture of policing and trying to change that, you're not going to do anything.
Izzy, I want to ask you a question now, and I'm not asking for a comparison with other penal systems or criminal justice systems in Norway or some of your more progressive countries. In this country, we have governed our criminal justice system, and I'll give you some examples. We have laws and we have internal rules and regulations, whether in the police community or the prison community, that says what people are supposed to do in virtually every given situation.
Mm-hmm.
And the end result of all the laws and the regulations and the court precedents and all that are designed to make sure that people do things in the right, just way within the parameter of due process of law. So the criminal justice system, and I'll take Malcolm X case, for example. We all know what was done to Malcolm X. That was done in 1965. Brady v. Maryland had come down in 1963, 2 years before Malcolm was assassinated, and the two innocent guys were railroaded and then prosecuted for that assassination. So if you look at the Supreme Court decision that juveniles should not be sentenced to life without parole, that they should be given a parole opportunity, and Henry Montgomery in Louisiana, who committed his crime when he was 16, was just paroled after 58 years, which is not, in the same day the last time he went up and was denied parole, another inmate, African-American inmate who had killed two African-American victims, was granted parole after far lesser years than Montgomery had served. So when you look at all the things that we have in place to ensure a legitimate due process outcome, why is it that we continue to hear about prosecutorial misconduct, police misconduct, prison brutality? So when you look at all that, how do you rate? What grade would you give our criminal justice system against that backdrop, Izzy?
Oh man. Well, I first of all, I think it's kind of a misnomer at this point. We have to stop. We have to come up with something else other than calling it a justice system. Change that. But I don't. I don't know. I'd give us like a 3, I guess. We're not we're not doing a great job at any of these stuff. And I remember there's something that I interviewed it was the head of probation and parole one time, and he was talking about parole and probation. And he said that the probation and parole system is you know, that road, the whole adage, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. It's very, very astute when it comes to our criminal justice system, because he was talking about probation and parole, and he was saying that, like, there's all these great intentions and they all come in the first year. But then if you look at all this system now, it's riddled with apathy and neglect and abuse because people stop paying attention. You get like a good influx for like a year of attention where we think we're doing a really great job. And then we're like, okay, job's over. We're good. We solved the problem. And then everybody stops paying attention and turns to other things. And then that thing that we set up to be so good and true just devolves back because nobody's watching it. Nobody's monitoring it. Nobody's regulating it. No one's funding it.
It sort of reminds me of a personal story that when I was in Angola, they had a prison chaplain. And part of the Angolite, I was interviewing him one day, and I know that a lot of people get on a religious pony and they try to use the religious pony to ride their way out of prison. They don't bit more believe in God or serving any heavily interest in than Charles Manson. But that said, I asked him. I said, "You know that some of these people are faking. You know that they're trying to game the religious system in the prison community." He said, "I know that." He said, "Most of them are." He said, "I got one thing going for me. As long as they're trying to game the system, they're having to behave. They're having to follow the rules. So if he's gaming, once he leaves, that's not my problem. As
Right.
long as he's in here and he's riding that religious pony, I ain't got to worry about him riding that criminal pony. So in a lot of ways, parole is the same way. As long as you make an effort to rehabilitate, and God knows what that definition may be to any given parole board because they all have their own definition of rehabilitation. It's all a process of, well, you expected to do certain things, you expect to participate here, you expect to have a certain attitude and certain sense of behavior and accomplishment, blah, blah, blah. The whole but it comes down to that the goals are never achieved. And that's the thing why I deserve the 3. And I think you're being kind of liberal with a 3.
Yeah, it's true. I am. I was being liberal. I was being nice. I mean, because like you just said, I don't know if it's all these misnomers. I don't think we have a rehabilitative penal system. We aren't focused on rehabilitation in this country, really. I mean, if we were, why would it be such a punitive system? Why would it be out the gate punitive, punishment, aggressively, violently punitive? I mean, a story I did one time, I mean, just looking at prison architecture, you can go to college and major in prison architecture. And what do you learn? You learn things like how to build a building to deprive people of any natural light. What is the rehabilitative point at that?
Yeah.
None
None.
whatsoever. None. And I, as a prisoner's wife for 25 years, there are all these other people standing outside of prison, women raising families on their own, one salary, and they have to take care of all the children and the effect that has on children and the long sentences that are not deserved. I also look at selective enforcement. If you don't have police reform, you can easily have situations where you can have 2 identical crimes permitted, whereas prisoner A gets a much lesser sentence than prisoner B because for some reason there's a political issue underlying prisoner B, i.e., that person may be Black, that person may be Hispanic, compared to white. For example, when Billy was talking about the Montgomery case, the guy that killed 2 Black people got out in the parole hearing before this last one that freed Montgomery. Montgomery was 16 years old when
16 years old.
His victim was a white deputy. So the selective enforcement issue, without police reform, you'll get it seems to me, again and again. Something has to be done about that.
100%. I have a friend named John Ruffin who served about 25 years on drug charges. He was actually he was basically a kingpin at the time, but he always talks about that, about how during his hearings, during other hearings he attended for people that he knew, it was fascinating to watch how many of the police were friends with the prosecutors, were hanging out with the defense attorneys, were friends with the judges, and it affected everything. And again, this is something that happens all the time, this cronyism that is unregulated and uncontrolled, and it just happens across the board. And in regards to the race issue, I mean, you talk about people getting off for random things. There's the story I think it's from earlier this week or maybe last week, of that rapist who raped 4 teenage girls and got 5 months probation.
Right.
What are we talking about?
And the judge said he spent the whole night thinking about how to impose the appropriate sentence. And that after a sleepless night and 4 or 5 cups of coffee, he came up with this probation for 4 rapes.
Exactly.
It's insane. But one thing I want to ask you is because I know you deal a lot with police reform, and I saw some article, it's been a while back, maybe a couple of weeks ago, where the writer was saying, do not eliminate qualified immunity, reform it. How in the hell do you reform qualified immunity? I mean, that is a court-created doctrine that gives the police and other government officials almost a blanket license to engage in misconduct. So what are we talking about in terms of reform?
Oh man, I'm going to mess up the details on this, but I did this in a story of mine. We talked about qualified immunity. So, qualified immunity was a Supreme Court decision that actually changed a previous decision that had to do with, I think, the school systems, in basically which you had to prove it to a certain point, and then the Supreme Court came in and they changed it. And they just made it qualified immunity. So I think the starting thing would be to take it back to what it was before, to where you had to actually prove something. It wasn't just assumed or assumptive and taken as face value. You had to prove the rightness of whatever it is that you did. I'm kind of messing up the details on that, but that's, I mean, for starters. But in all honesty, you could just get rid of it and start over with something else possibly and still have the best effect. Like,
well, I think to govern civil liability, because qualified immunity only goes to civil liability. So to govern civil liability, I think it's time for Congress to deal with qualified, to define what civil protections a government official may have in a variety of given situations. Obviously, if you shoot and kill someone and it violates it the way it is today, you have to prove that the officer not only had intent to do it, you have to prove that there was a law that prohibited that particular type of shooting and that he was aware of that shooting when he pulled a trigger, which is, I mean, plaintiff bringing a lawsuit against the police department or that officer has a virtually insurmountable obstacle to get by. So I think that if we start with congressional or with legislation trying to define qualified immunity and what it does and how it applies, then that will take it out of the court's hands of saying, well, this is a court-created doctrine. This is what we decided the way it should be.
I mean, I agree. I mean, something has to change given the fact that, I mean, we give benefits of the doubt to these people who are just citizens. That's another thing, that police aren't not citizens. This is idea that you become a cop and you're like above a citizen. You're not. You're not above a citizen. You're prone to the same laws, but we give these people this benefit of the doubt when it's been proven that they are poorly trained, inexperienced, aren't given any mental health, any wellness checks, any psychology checks, aren't given anything. They're given a gun and a badge, and they're just kind of allowed to go. I mean, there are police departments in rural areas of this country where you can be 18 years old and you only need like 2 weeks of training. Yeah. That's insane. And then then if that person shoots somebody, they're gonna get the benefit of the doubt because they're a police officer.
But see, training does not by itself in and of itself make a bad cop a good cop any more than makes a bad person a good person. So there's a lot of things, as you said, there's a lot of things you can do in the training program that will try to increase his professionalism. But at the core of it, if you got a bad person and that person is, I don't care how much training you give him, he's going to respond like a bad person in any given situation. I mean,
oh, absolutely. And even if you do give him the training, I mean, it's arguable. Aren't you just training him how to get away with whatever he wants to do anyways? And it's also, I mean, with policing, training it comes down to hiring and recruitment. The people you're letting in to become police officers. I've talked with so many people that have said we need to stop talking about training. We need to make sure that these people aren't getting into into this profession.
Yeah, exactly.
Because at best, you have grossly negligent, incompetent people who are becoming a danger because they get this job. And at worst, you have predatory people that are attracted to the profession because of the power that it gives them.
Let me illustrate something to you 1 second, Izzy. If you look at shift change in a regular prison and you see all the guards going out, all the ones coming in, they all may not be the best physical specimens, but they have their shirts and their pants. Their shoes are more often not shine. They carry themselves in a different way because that is part of training. Training can teach them how to dress, how to act. If you go to a private prison where the emphasis is on the lower salary, the emphasis is not on training. The training you give him is when you make sure he can sign his name on the job application form and he's hired. If you watch one of those shifts, and I have seen this, you watch, they come out slovenly, shirts out of their pants, shoes with mud on them, ain't shaved, and God knows when. I'm not talking about just the right to wear a beard. I'm talking about because he was too lazy that morning to get up and put a razor to the face.
Right.
So, those are the people the private prison industry attract. The government-run prison industry at least tries to attract some better personnel. And that can be extrapolated to the same thing to police departments.
Mm-hmm.
Police departments have now reached a point to where they will hire virtually anybody that can carry a gun, shoot a gun, and know how to use mace and everything else. If he can be trained and knows, he's going to get a job. And I think the first thing we got to do toward eliminating police misconduct is to demilitarize our police. As long as we allow them to think they're not here to protect and serve. When you militarize them, they're there to hurt people.
100%. And that actually goes back to what I always say. It's about changing the culture of policing because it is a militarized culture that I did. So one of the first big assignments that I did was I did this 3-part story where I was actually able to follow a team of recruits through the NYPD's new training back in 2016, 2017. And that was when they just rolled out again all of their de-escalation and all of their stuff like that. And it was very good. When I went through, they did all of the stuff. But the one thing that I noticed of is that above all of it, so de-escalation, conflict resolution, all of that stuff is taught. I mean, at least in major departments, but it's kind of at a whisper to the bellow that is the kind of militarized culture of policing. I mean, these people did all the de-escalation stuff and everything like that. And then when I went to the graduation, they're looking at a graduation video that's shot like a Michael Bay movie and has James Earl Jones narrating it like it's an action film. Like, what is that? How does that contradicts what you're doing? You can't have a militarized culture in policing that sees everybody as the enemy. But so often that's what these people are getting taught when they're coming out of the academy. It's us versus them. Once you get out here, you're in enemy territory and you need to act as such.
Yeah.
And it's creating this contentious environment that's also, one, fairly unrealistic, and two, just wholly dangerous, especially because then you have people coming out and they're getting told, forget everything that you learned in the academy. This is how we do it on the streets.
Well, I think what illustrates that perfectly, and this is one of the last issues I'll bring up, is that young man who was shot to death with his hands in the air right out there on a freeway, standing next to a cliff, and all the cops are behind the police cars, and he is shot to death while his hands are in the air, and he has made no movement toward hurting anyone. So I think it's wonderful that we have someone like you, Izzy, who is so schooled in these things, so concerned about these things. And this is why we need to make sure that the crime report continues to be funded, that this, I don't know how long the fundraising effort lasts, but if you could let the listeners know, okay, this is how you can contribute to this really outstanding organization that's not only telling both sides of the story, but is deeply investigating both sides of the story and the facts. So the crime report can be relied upon. I think that's the most important issue about that. Because I have this vision in my mind of that young man, I think he was early 20s, maybe 24, standing on the edge of the cliff with his hands in the air, and he is literally assassinated right there by police officers. But that's why it's so important to fund the crime report, because you all deal with what creates a situation like that. So if you can tell our listeners.
Are there any thought that you would like to leave with us, Izzy? Anything that you would like to say that about the crime report, and or any other issue you wish to express of you?
I mean, well, on that unfortunate story, I mean, I will tell you that officer, I guarantee you, got more weapons training than he got de-escalation training. On average, it's like 8 hours, 10 hours for de-escalation, and then 80 to 150 hours for range training. So if you're going to train guys to use their guns more than to actually talk to people, you're going to run into situations like that.
This has been one informative session, and we truly appreciate you taking the time to discuss these issues with us, because we both have a tremendous amount of respect for the crime report. It's on my favorites. I go there every morning. I go there to check to see what y'all are saying. And I walk away, every day I walk away with something new, a new perspective.
I appreciate that so much, and thank you so much for having me and for reading. And I love the talks. I know I don't get enough of them. I spend most of my time writing. So, anytime you guys want to talk, let me know.
Let everybody know before you go, not only how to contribute to the crime report, but let's also let them know about your podcast.
Oh, yeah. So I'm on Behind the Blue Curtain, which is a podcast that was started by Stan Mason, who's ex-cop out of ex-police officer out of Waco, Texas. And we're on there with a chief of police in Texas and a lead detective in Chicago and a former prison inmate in Connecticut, and then myself. We talk every Saturday about policing issues, race issues, pretty much whatever. So we're always there. That's on Behind the Blue Curtain. For the crime report, go to crimereport.org, and you'll see it right there. In terms of, there's going to be a little link to donate, and better than donate, subscribe and read what we're offering. We're on Instagram at Crime Report Media, and the same thing on Twitter. So please find us, share. We need the readers.
Right. Well, you are fulfilling a desperate need in this country at this time. So I thank you very much, and I thank the crime report very much. I really do.
And stay safe.
Thank you so much.
Stay safe, Izzy.
Yes, sir. You too. And thank you both for what you're doing, and also for the high praise. I really appreciate it. Coming from you guys, that's incredible.
You deserve it.
Oh, thank you.
This podcast comes from Unincarcerated Productions and Grindle Industries. Every episode of Justice Delayed is produced and edited by Cameron Collins and Milo Bershane. Music on this episode is from Speculation. Learn more and check out Spec at speculation.bandcamp.com. That's spekulation.bandcamp.com. And of course, head on over to unincarcerated.com to find out more about Unincarcerated Productions. We will see you all next time.